Before we dive in, if you've been wanting to grow your podcast without spending hours on marketing every single week, I have something for you. Hot Pod Summer Camp is a free 3-day live challenge happening from June 9th through June 11th, where we use AI to build the systems that grow your show all summer long, even when you're at the pool with a drink in your hand. It's only 1 hour a day and it's completely free. You can grab your spot by going to podcastingformoms.co/summer. All right, let's get into the episode. If your podcast is getting listeners, but those listeners are not turning into leads, inquiries, clients, or sales, there is a very good chance that your podcast doesn't actually have a funnel. Because mentioning your offer for 15 seconds at the end of an episode is not a podcast funnel. And honestly, most podcasters are creating content with absolutely no listener journey behind it whatsoever. They're recording episodes, posting content, showing up consistently, but there's no strategic pathway guiding listeners from, hey, I found your podcast, to I trust you enough to buy from you. And that is what I want to talk about today. Because the goal of your podcast isn't just to create content for the sake of creating content. The goal is to reach new people, nurture them, and eventually convert the right listeners into buyers. So today we're going to be breaking down the podcast funnel that most podcasters are completely missing and how to actually turn your podcast into a strategic business asset instead of just another piece of content on the internet. Let's dive in. Welcome to Podcasting for Moms, the show for moms in business ready to start, grow, and scale a podcast that turns their listeners into buyers. I'm Jenny Sonneson, a podcast strategist and fellow mom entrepreneur. You're in the right place if you want to learn how to start and grow a podcast that attracts your ideal clients and really does the heavy lifting for you when it comes to selling your offers, all while balancing life as a busy mom. Are you ready to create a podcast that grows your income, impact, and influence? Let's make podcasting work for you, because as moms, we know how to get things done. All right, let's jump into the episode. Welcome to Podcasting for Moms. I'm Jenny Sonneson, a podcast strategist and the founder of Podcasting for Moms, where I help busy mom entrepreneurs launch, grow, and monetize podcasts strategically and sustainably. And honestly, this is one of the biggest mindset shifts that I wish more podcasters understood earlier. Because a lot of podcasters think, if I just keep posting episodes consistently, eventually people are going to buy. But consistency without strategy is not a funnel. And this is exactly why some podcasts can have smaller audiences but generate actual revenue, while others have thousands of downloads and barely any conversions. Because one podcast has a strategic ecosystem behind it, and the other is just posting episodes into the void, hoping that people magically figure out the next step. Let's get into it. So let's talk about what most people think a podcast funnel is. So most podcasters think a podcast funnel looks like this. Hey, if you like this episode, check out my offer. The end. That's it. And listen, should you mention your offers on your podcast? Absolutely, 100%. You definitely should. But simply dropping your offer link at the end of an episode is not an intentional funnel strategy, because most listeners are not ready to immediately buy from you after hearing one random episode. Especially if they just discovered you, they barely know your philosophy, they don't fully understand the transformation that you provide, or there's zero bridge between the episode and the offer. And this is where most podcasters get frustrated, because they think, well, I'm pitching, so why isn't anyone buying? But the issue usually isn't the podcast itself. It is the missing nurture process between the content and the sale. So you may be wondering, what should a podcast funnel actually look like? And in my opinion, it is much simpler than people make it. Your podcast funnel should look something like this: podcast episode, to strategic call to action, to freebie or private podcast, to nurture sequence, to offer. That's it. Simple, intentional, and strategic. Your podcast episode should not try to do all the heavy lifting by itself. Instead, the episode should create awareness, connection, trust, and curiosity. Then your call to action should move listeners into a more intentional environment where you can continue the conversation. That is the key. Your podcast should not be the end of the journey, although it could be, but it should be the entry point into your ecosystem. And that is why I love private podcast funnels so much. And that is why I love things like private podcast funnels so much, because instead of ending the relationship after the episode, you're able to continue it. You're deepening the trust, you're building authority, you're creating bingeable momentum, and helping listeners move closer to becoming buyers naturally. Can we also talk about random freebies for a second? Because this is another thing I see all the time. A podcaster records an episode about something like podcast growth, and then their call to action is something completely disconnected, like download my morning routine guide. As you can see, there is no strategic alignment there. Your freebie should feel like the natural next step after the episode, not a random thing that you created 3 years ago and slapped onto every episode because you need to have a call to action. Your call to action should answer the question, what does this listener need next? That is the missing piece. If your episode is about podcast funnels, then the next step should logically deepen that conversation. Maybe it's a private podcast series, a checklist, a framework, a mini training, or a workshop. But it should feel connected because strategic funnels create momentum while random funnels create confusion. So let's talk about why most podcasts aren't converting. So a lot of podcasts are not converting because the episodes themselves don't have strategy behind them. They're creating content, but they're not intentionally moving listeners anywhere. And this is where I think podcasters accidentally slip into hobby podcast territory because strategic podcasts are built intentionally. Every episode has a purpose, every call to action has a purpose, every freebie has a purpose, and every nurture email has a purpose. That doesn't mean that every episode has to be wildly salesy, not at all. But it does mean that you should know, what is this episode helping my audience do? What belief is this shifting? What problem is this solving? And where should this listener go next? Because content without direction creates stalled listeners, and stalled listeners rarely become buyers. And while we're here, please stop giving your listener 47 calls to action at the end of your episodes. I say this lovingly, but if your outro sounds like, follow me on Instagram, join my Facebook group, download my freebie, leave a review, check out my membership, apply for coaching, subscribe to my YouTube channel, etc., then your listeners are going to do exactly none of that. People need clarity. One episode, one goal, one next step. That is it. And honestly, your call to action should feel like a continuation of the episode, not a commercial interruption. It should feel helpful and not forced. Now, I briefly want to talk about discoverability because this matters too. Podcast SEO and discoverability are the top of the funnel. This is how new people find you in the first place. And this is another reason why strategy matters so much, because if your content is searchable, your episodes can continue bringing in aligned listeners long after you publish them. And that's very powerful because your podcast becomes a long game visibility tool, not just content that disappears after 24 hours like on social media. But again, I want you to know discoverability alone is not enough. You still need the nurture process after they discover you because visibility without conversion strategy is simply incomplete. So if there's one shift I want you to make after listening to this episode, it's this. Stop asking yourself, how do I get more downloads? And start asking, what journey am I guiding my listeners through? Because podcasting is not just about content creation. It's about relationship building, trust building, authority building, connection building, and eventually conversion. The goal is not just to get people to listen, but it's to move the right people deeper into your ecosystem so they eventually become buyers. That's the difference between a hobby podcast and a strategic podcast. And if you're realizing while listening to this episode that your podcast is missing an intentional funnel strategy, I want to invite you to check out my private podcast series called the Podcast Profit Blueprint. Inside, I break down how to strategically turn your podcast into a tool that actually supports your business growth instead of just creating more content to keep up with. We talk about listener journeys, strategic calls to action, monetization, podcast ecosystems, and how to create a podcast that nurtures listeners into buyers. You can grab the link to sign up for that in the show notes. All right, that's it for this episode. I'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning into Podcasting for Moms. I hope today's episode gave you the tools and inspiration you need to make your podcast work smarter, not harder. If you love what you heard, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It means the world and helps other moms in business find the show. For more tips, resources, and support, head to podcastingformoms.co. Remember, you're not just building a podcast, you're building your legacy. Until next time, friends.